Welcome to the fourth monthly Motivation Monday of the season. My name is Nicolai, and I'm a third-year doctoral student at Virginia Commonwealth University. Motivation Monday is hosted by the Graduate Student Committee of AERA's Motivation and Education SIG, and we offer this programming as a way to disseminate and share ideas and strategies for conducting educational research. This year, Motivation Monday is a little different than previous years. And if you've been here, you've kind of gotten to see that, and we'll continue with this format throughout the rest of the year. But our wonderful graduate student leader team, shout out to Maggie, Preeti, and Yin and multiple other people for their great work on this, but have organized a series of live panels and discussions each month. So make sure that you keep coming back. So before we get started, I wanted to take time to acknowledge that this month we're celebrating Black History Month, and we're honoring the sacrifices and contributions of Black people across all domains. The GSC recognizes, appreciates, and applauds all of the Black scholars who have contributed and continue to contribute to educational research. And now we'd like to introduce our panelists to you all. So today we have four amazing scholars here to discuss how to manage the R&R, or Revise and Resubmit process effectively. So first up, we have Dr. Eric Anderman. He is a professor in the Department of Educational Studies at The Ohio State University. His research over the past 25 years has focused on academic motivation. He is a fellow of both the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. And additionally, he is the editor of Theory into Practice, and he has recently published an article titled The Relations of Inattention and Hyperactivity to Academic Cheating in Adolescents with Executive Functioning Problems. So I'll put a link in that article to the chat. Next, we have Dr. Christy Byrd. She is an associate professor in teacher education and learning sciences at North Carolina State University. Dr. Byrd's research examines how students make sense of race and culture in their school environments. She uses quantitative and qualitative methods to explore topics such as racial discrimination, multicultural education, and culturally relevant teaching. And she recently published an article titled School Ethnic Racial Socialization and Adolescent Ethnic Racial Identity. And that link will be in the chat for that site, for that article. Next, we have Dr. Alison Koenka. She is an assistant professor in educational psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on the motivational consequences of academic feedback, academic motivation in understudied and underrepresented students, and developing methodological guidelines in educational and psychological research. She recently published an article titled Grade Expectations: The Motivational Consequences of Performance Feedback on a Summative Assessment. And the link for that article will be in the chat as well. And then last but certainly not least, we have Brooke Harris-Thomas. She is a doctoral graduate student at Michigan State. Her research interests focus on belonging, motivation, middle school, and Black girlhood. She is a community engaged researcher and school board member. She has presented at multiple conferences on her research interests and community engaged research. And recently she has passed her comps, defended her practicum, and is now working on her dissertation. And she is our esteemed graduate student on the panel. So today our discussion will follow three sections. First, a discussion with our panelists, then a chance to have your questions answered, and then a collective and interactive activity on managing the R&R process in education research. So first, our discussion today will begin with understanding key steps in the R&R process, and then will lead to strategies and approaches related to managing the R&R process effectively in educational research. And this question is for all of the panelists. Can you walk us through the key steps you engage when you work on an R&R? And if you can elaborate a little bit about what this timeline looks like as well. And if we need a little motivation, oh, Brooke, I see that you unmuted, so go free. I was gonna do a cold call.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning some of this myself, so I can kind of give my perspective as a graduate student on it. So when we received a revise and resubmit, it's very exciting, but it's also daunting to kind of get into the reviewers' comments. So it's nice that they're inviting you to come back, but there's work to be done. So it's kind of a balance of emotion, I think, there. But what we kind of look at is the timeline that the publishers give us. So they'll usually say, let me know if you feel like you're going to be able to accomplish these edits within the last one was 2 months time. And even getting clarity, does that mean like 2 months, like it was February and now it's March, April, or is it literally 60 days? And, so even those specific things can be good to clarify so you have in mind kind of what that exact timeline is. Because if you miss it and you've done all that work, it's heartbreaking. So that's kind of how we've approached the timeline piece. And then the key steps that I've noticed is that you kind of look at it as in an overview. And I've been the second author in the last couple that I've worked on. And so the first author really does take the lion's share of the work, but there's also, it's kind of like divide and conquer different sections. So like I wouldn't have been I wouldn't have had a lot of understanding the methods that we used. So I'm not going to take revising the methods questions, but I did a lot of work on the introduction section and some of the discussion. So when we're looking at what things to address, we kind of divided by who was taking what and who kind of has the best expertise, and kind of divided by then, and then start to set deadlines for meetings. I really like an approach where we meet more often for shorter periods of time, because it helps us to keep the momentum going, because there's a million other things happening. So it can kind of get bogged down. So that's just some answers to how we've approached getting a revise and resubmit.
I guess I would add what I always tell people, and I do this myself too, is the first thing you do is have your pity party and feel sorry for yourself and go through your 12 steps of anger and rage and being annoyed at the reviewers, and then take a deep breath, let it sit for a few days, don't deal with it as soon as it comes in, let it sit for a few days, then go back with a fresh pair of eyes and do what Brooke said, essentially. Make a plan for who's going to do what. My way I work with all my grad students and with colleagues, and that I recommend to others, is that the first author is the one who is the taskmaster, and it's their job to make sure everything gets done, and to make sure everything gets done in a timely manner. And then I'm a big fan of putting dates in Outlook. So I'll put, if I have something I have to do for it, I'll just put, have my part of the revision done by Wednesday, the 18th. And I just put it in there, and I know if I do that, I'll get it done. Yeah, I mean, I have, I'll just stop there. I have other things to say about the other parts, but it's, really, I mean, my most important thing is just don't do it immediately. Give yourself time and then go for it.
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in. Oh, sorry, Christy, go ahead.
No, you go ahead first.
Okay, I was just going to jump in to very quickly say that I completely agree with everything that Eric and Brooke shared. And I think that I really like what Brooke said about the balance of emotions, and then also what Eric said about the pity party, because all of the above are kind of true, where an R&R is amazing news, actually. It's great news, but it doesn't mean that it's not, as Brooke said, extremely daunting. And you're probably going to be perhaps, I would say definitely overwhelmed, and maybe also a little bit initially frustrated with some of the comments that are raised. So when I was thinking about this question that the organizers shared in advance, the first thing that I suggested was kind of similar to Eric's, which was take a walk, go for a run, take a bit of a breather, and spend a few days after skimming the comments to let it sit. And then to really go back to the comments, first of all, I would say at that point, especially to make sure to share it with your co-authors right away if you haven't already done so. And then read through the comments really, really carefully at that point, once it's sat for a few days. And once you've kind of taken a little bit of a walk and taken some time, at that point, I would say what I do is I read the comments really carefully. And then just as Eric was saying, if I'm the first author, I take the time to organize and to be kind of a taskmaster in that way, to make sure that there's a plan in place and then to come up with a tentative game plan. But I'll stop there because I know that Dr. Byrd probably has some great advice to add too.
I mean, all of those things are true for me. I don't have a pity party. I have an angry party. Like in my head, I write out all of the like, you're so stupid. How dare you not understand this? But yes, you have to take a few days because, you know, you have to put it in the context of they're coming to this new, they haven't been steeped in the article in the same way that you have. And a lot of times they have really good points. And so you really do have to take that time to have the emotional distance. The only things I would add is that now with my co-authors, I use Google Docs, and that has made the revision process really easy because we can see who's addressing what comments, we can track all of the changes, and you can do the little, you know, the tag people of like, you work on this, you work on that. So that's been really convenient. And then something about the timeline is that these journals, a lot of it's just automated. So they'll send an email and say, this revision is due in 60 days. But if you look at your calendar and you're like, I'm going to be at AERA in 60 days, you can email them back and say, can I get a different date? Can I get an extension? You know, they're usually flexible about that because it really is a lot of just automated, like, okay, we need this turnaround time. So we're just going to put in an automatic date in there.
Can I just add one thing? I agree with that. The only exception to that is for special issues. Special issues, they generally will not give you a lot of flexibility because there are very strict deadlines with the publisher. So don't expect as much leeway if you're writing something for a special issue as with everything else.
Well, thank you all for your answers. And I really appreciate the acknowledgement towards feelings and emotions and getting an R&R, because it is like mixed emotions with it, and the anger party. Keep that in mind. And I think we've already started to learn some different ways to organize throughout the R&R process. So thank you. And I think that goes nicely into the second question that Dr. Koenka was mentioning. But what strategies or tools do you use to complete an R&R? So how do you stay organized? I think we've already started to touch a little bit on this, like how do you approach a revision with collaborators? And how do you manage or prioritize an R&R with other ongoing responsibilities? And I think particularly Brooke would be interested in your answer as a graduate student, that a lot of those other responsibilities, grad students don't necessarily have as much control over the timelines. So that was a lot in one question, but who wants to make a go for it first?
Continue talking about kind of the organizational piece, like having one person, usually the first author, in charge of divvying up things and, sending out reminders or checking to make sure things are done can be really useful. I'd also say that it's really good to have, what I do is that, how I have writing days. So I have days where, I'm teaching, and then days where okay, this is for writing. And I try not to schedule other meetings during that time. And so when I have an R&R, that becomes one of the things to do on those writing days. And so that's helpful to just sort of sit and look at the comments. And it's oftentimes what do I feel like addressing today? Because it might be I only have the energy to deal with these little typo things or the small things. And other days I'm really fired up and okay, let me go with this big conceptual issue that they want to, that they had a problem with. Because some of the revisions are going to take more time than others. Some of them will require you to go back and read something new or do an analysis again or add something to the analysis, whereas others really are more just textual issues. And so I try to really pay attention to where my energy is and kind of what I have the capability to do instead of forcing myself you have to do this particular thing today.
I also, and somebody mentioned using Google Docs, I keep the letter and the reviews in a separate document in Google Docs, and we use that as a sort of, we literally go through and assign people, Eric, do this, so-and-so do this, you do this. And then when it's done, the person doing it actually writes into the Google Doc this, basically it's the beginning of the response letter. So they write in, we address this, here's how on page so-and-so. And that way, We have the letter being written as we make the revisions. And it also is a way to keep track of people. So if somebody hasn't done their part, I or the first author can just get on and say, so-and-so, get with the program. You gotta do your part. You haven't done it yet. And we all see the same thing.
Yeah, I'll jump in there because I think so. Totally agree with everything that that the panelists have said, and to add on and really amplify something that Eric started talking about is I think a really important strategy that is not intuitive. So I want to make sure to say it, or it's not necessarily intuitive, is as you're working through the different revision comments, it is highly advisable to, first of all, track everything that you're doing. So everything should be done in track changes, but also to really kind of write notes to yourself in your shared spreadsheet or document or whatever it is about how you ended up going to address that. And then what I think goes along with that, which Eric was just talking about, is when you're addressing a comment, I would recommend immediately or as soon as possible afterwards, writing that response to the reviewer, or at least drafting it. And the reason why is because it's always very fresh in my mind when I'm working on addressing a specific comment, how exactly I addressed it and why. But it's amazing what happens to memory when, let's say, like a month has gone by and then you go back and you're like, what did I do and why did I do it? And all that. So I would say that one thing I would recommend is track everything, especially because some journals actually require a tracked version of the document, or just I've had a couple of experiences like that. And then also, in addition to tracking and making notes to yourself about what and how you addressed a specific comment, I find it saves a lot of time to actually at least draft. It doesn't have to be perfect, but to draft the response. And then the other thing that I think is really, really important, and full credit goes to my colleague at BCU, Sharon Zumbrun, for this, but she has this amazing spreadsheet system that I've since adapted for the R&Rs that I lead as well, that kind of has an overview and quotes of all of the different reviewer comments, and then also the person responsible, as Eric was saying as well, and then how it's handled and what the specific response is, and that's all tracked within a spreadsheet. And I find that really helpful. So I think that organization is really key. And then the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Brooke, and this is a comment that I think is especially important for grad students to hear, because it's not, again, intuitive, is I love something. I don't know if Eric remembers this, but when I was working with Eric as a postdoc, I love something that he always used to say to me. He would always say when he was a supporting author on things that I was leading, quote, "Put me to work." So I say that again to reinforce a point that was made earlier, that just because you're the first author on something does not mean that you are expected to do everything yourself. Make sure to rely on your co-authors, because let's say, Dr. Byrd was the person who is responsible for the methods. She, even if she's not the first author, is best positioned to address most methodological comments that come up. So I'll pause there, but yeah, totally agree with all of the great advice that the panelists gave before me.
Yeah, it's really nice, I find, to keep the exact language of the reviewer comment when I'm trying to address whatever they're asking. So I don't make like a summary thing or kind of boil it down. Like for me, that exact language is helpful to make sure I'm not missing out on what they're asking me to do. And so we get it in an email, and essentially we copy and paste it into a Google document and kind of space it apart. So every comment, so even if it's like reviewer 2 had maybe 3 different comments about the introduction, they kind of space them out into 3 different parts. And then we'll use the comment to kind of highlight it and say like, okay, Brooke's doing this thing. And then any other notes that I may want to make about how I'm addressing it, we put it right in the comment there. And then like you all were saying, it's really nice to be able to then, once you've addressed it, start to draft that language into the revision letter, because it's kind of a pain to have done all that work and now you've got to like basically rehash it all. So if you can do the double duty, I totally agree with that. And then we have, I like how Dr. Byrd said to let it be a little bit like you're kind of feeling, or you're kind of go where your motivation takes you, because hopefully it's a path of least resistance that day and you can make some good progress. So I don't, in the ones that I've worked on, we haven't gone in a linear way, like from top to bottom. It's kind of like, what makes the most sense? What are we feeling drawn to addressing? Maybe it makes most sense to address something conceptual before you get into the specific things. Or maybe they're like, we want you to talk more specifically about the sample in the introduction. Well, that's quick and easy. So maybe I just want a couple of check marks so then I can do that. So it doesn't have to be a linear process either. Kind of going to where you need to, where you feel drawn to isn't a bad thing. And then as far as just time management as a graduate student, I can't say that I've got it totally figured out, because this feels urgent. Like there's a timeline and there's some sense of like urgency around it. So I kind of like forsook other things because I wanted to make sure I did my part. So I guess what I can say is that, so for example, I had gotten a little bit behind on my RA responsibilities. And so I just needed to communicate with my advisor and just say like, hey, I'm on the deadline. We got 2 weeks till this thing is due and I just need the extra time. And luckily my advisor was like, okay, I get it, knock it out. And then we just need you to catch these things up. And so some of it's just going to need to be in communication ahead of time, or as you see those deadlines coming. And then otherwise, I think like you can't know when a revision is going to come back to you per se, but I was trying to look for opportunities where I can say I need a pause, or can we take a break from this, or I need to step back for a month. And again, I guess it's just communication and just trying to understand what you're capable of, so I don't overpromise and underdeliver on something that I'm supposed to be doing. But I feel like for me as a grad student, because I want to get publications and because I'm on this timeline and I'm working with other people, it just felt like the R&Rs get pushed to the top of my priority list pretty quickly once you get that timeline in place, if that makes sense.
And I'll just add really quickly, I think that those are such important points. And I would argue and I would hope that most people, and this is something actually that I wanted to communicate today, never rushing, but getting an R&R back to peer review as quickly as possible while thoroughly and thoughtfully addressing all of the comments is really and truly in everybody's best interests on the authorship team. Because at that point, there's a good chance, it's not definitive, it's not 100%, but there's a good chance it's so close, or it's getting so close to the finish line that it really is in everybody's best interest. And I would hope that advisors, for example, understand that. And I really like Brooke's point about communication, just in case that doesn't work, if that support isn't there. Something that I think is helpful is, I've said this to Corey before and probably to others, but it's so odd. Like when you work with someone so closely, you kind of get to know their schedule in a kind of like, I knew when I worked with my advisor in grad school, I knew what time he got up in the morning, when he scheduled his meetings, when he would want to meet with me. I was able to pretty well, like anticipate that pretty well. And so I think that, if the communication piece doesn't work as well, and if you're experiencing not a ton of support from an advisor, which I hope and suspect will not frequently be the case, but I think maybe planning your schedule kind of around when you anticipate your advisor or your supervisor needing certain things from you would probably be a good strategy. So just wanted to add that in case. But Brooke, I love your point about communication.
Thank you all for your answers. My dog was coughing, so if you hear him, yeah, I'll be back to take care of that in a second. But I really appreciate everyone bringing up the response letter, because as a grad student, I didn't know that we had response letters until I started doing the first R&R I was on. And I could imagine if you don't know, that would be so much work to make up. And then Brooke, I really appreciated your point about communicating and being open and honest, and hopefully, to Dr. Koenka's point, we all have those relationships, but it is really important to be like realistic with ourselves, and things like kind of advocating for yourself to do that. But the next question is, drawing from your perspectives as a mentor, reviewer, and or action editor, What are some common mistakes that you see authors make when they submit their revision? And are there any like major no-nos when it comes to it?
I can respond to that from dealing with this all the time. And very confidently that there are a couple of things that are just absolutely things you don't want to do. The first, most important thing is you want to respond to every single comment raised by every reviewer and the editor. Don't skip something. Don't skip anything. You don't have to do everything, but you have to respond to everything. If you don't respond to something, that reviewer, when they're reading it, they will notice that and they will just get turned off and, think, who the heck do they think they are? They didn't respond to everything. You've got to respond to every single point. That's the first thing. The second thing that I have learned over time that will greatly help you is to not make the reviewers do a lot of work. For every single thing you write, refer them to the page number in the revised manuscript where they can find what you did. You can even say page 24, second paragraph. Help them find that. The worst thing, and I've seen this, that gets me as a reviewer getting something back, or as an editor, if I'm as an editor, sometimes I've sent things back to authors and said, I'm not taking this until you've got to help the reviewers. You just need to make it easy for them. Make it as easy as possible for them. Don't make them do a lot of work. And the other thing is, if there's something methodological that a reviewer suggests and you don't know how to do it and no one on your team knows how to do it, consider consulting with someone who does know how, maybe even bringing someone on board who's an author who can help you do that. But I have seen sometimes, to give you an example, like sometimes a reviewer will say, in a study that involves classrooms, did you look at the interclass correlation, and is there significant variance between classrooms? And in the response, they'll say something like, yes, we looked at it, it was really low, so we decided not to use multi-level analysis. Like that's not good. That tells me, you didn't know how to do it or you didn't want to do it. So you find someone who can do that and can help you compose an appropriate response. If it's necessary to do it, then you need to do it. If you're not going to do it, you need to explain why. But if they bring it up, it does need to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed in a way that proves that you understand it. And if you don't, like I said, go to a stat consulting lab or whatever. I'll stop there.
I will speak. I'm a, they call it a consulting editor, but I basically review at least 6 manuscripts a year for a journal. And from that experience, it is wild how people will say like, oh yeah, we made some changes to the introduction. And reviewers do not get paid, right? We are fitting this service in along with everything else that we have to do. And so it becomes annoying when you have to like dig and try and find what changes someone made. So making it as easy as possible for the reviewers helps them to have a positive attitude toward your revision, but also just to make everyone's life easier. Like you already have your Google Doc where you had all the changes, like what Brooke put, where you have direct quotes, love direct quotes. It's just write the whole thing, copy the paragraph if you need to, because that way I can, because a lot of times when reviewers ask a question, they have something very specific in mind. And so if you can show where you directly enter that, it just really helps. And I think that this idea of getting, I just want to add on what Eric said, getting outside consultation is very important, because I'll tell you what I notice happens when reviewers read things, right? Is that sometimes it's like a little question that pops up. It's like, oh, I wonder about this. Like, what's the ICC of that? And sometimes it's like a really big question, like, wait a second, your theory does not support this analysis. And you want to treat every concern as if it's that big question. Like, you don't necessarily have to redo everything, but if you're not clear and you just want to say like, oh yeah, of course we did that, that might be the chance where you can just run it by your advisor, run it by a stats consultant to say, is this a big deal, or, what's the best way to approach this? because you don't want to blow it off, because then the reviewer will think like, wait, they don't really care about my concerns. They didn't really put, any serious effort into this. And I think we'll get to the question where it's like, what do you do if you really disagree? But, just those are just some things to start out with.
Yeah, as usual, in case anyone was watching my video as Eric and Christy were talking, I was like, yes, I so agree. And then I think Brooke raised such an important thought and question in the chat as well. And so I echo everything. A couple of things that it's so interesting, actually. I was kind of laughing as I was looking back at the questions today, because over the past week, I just reviewed 2 different manuscripts, and I thought to myself, I wish if it didn't compromise the peer review process, I wish I could show, and it would, so I won't, but I wish I could show the response letter that I just received, because it was literally the most like exemplary way to write a response letter I've ever seen. It was comment. So first of all, something that I learned from, and that, by the way, as an aside, you don't get paid as a reviewer, and it can be time consuming work, but you also learn a lot when you have the opportunity to review manuscripts. And something that I learned from this one is they numbered the comments and then referred back to specific comment numbers. And I have never done that before when I've been responsible for drafting a response letter. And so that was something. So they numbered the comments, as I think it was Brooke who pointed out, directly quoted the reviewers, and then wrote a response, a very detailed response, given their rationale for why they chose to address, or why they agreed with the specific comment that I made, or why they disagreed with it. And then directly below that came the direct quote with the specific page numbers, and I think even the paragraph numbers. So that really reinforces, I think, what both Christy and Eric were saying about make this as easy for your reviewers as possible, as easy. And it's one of the many things as well that I've learned from Eric in working with him as a postdoc, is being as transparent as possible, I think kind of goes along with that. One thing that I'll add that I don't think has come up yet is, so there are several different ways to structure a response letter. One is kind of like through a thematic structuring. So, multiple reviewers may have made the same comment about the conceptual model or something like that. So you might group those things together, and then you might group certain like methodological comments together. So thematic, and then by reviewer. So reviewer 1, all of reviewer 1's comments. Reviewer 2, all of reviewer 2's comments. I'm curious to hear what the other panelists say. I realize that now that I've done a lot of reviewing, I strongly prefer the latter approach. So all of the reviewer 2 comments and responses together, all of the reviewer 3, because as for me, again, curious to hear what other people have to say about that. But so Eric agrees, I see in the chat, because it's so much easier for the reviewer, again, in the spirit of making things just as easy as possible for the reviewer. For me, if I'm reviewer 2, which I swear, whenever I'm reviewer 2, I'm nice. There's this bad reputation that sometimes happens with reviewer. But if I'm reviewer 2, then I go to my section and I really focus on the sections that are kind of directly in response to my comments. So yeah, sorry.
But you don't have to rewrite the same thing. If you're a reviewer 2 and reviewer 1, what made the same comment, then for reviewer 2, you just write, for their comment, you say, see my response to viewer 1.3. So you don't have to redo it, but do it in order, like follow. So the reviewer can just read through. The reviewers want to know what were my concerns? Did you address mine? But most of the time will be overlap. So you can just refer to the first time. Reviewer 3s might be really short because you keep referring them to 1 and 2. That's okay.
Yeah, I also agree with that approach, because only if I'm really interested in the paper will I read the other people's reviews. A lot of times it's like, okay, well, I just care about, did they address my concerns? And I might scan through the other reviews, but I'm not going to, the thematic approach makes it sort of like you have to hunt for what they did in response to you.
Yeah. And then one other thing, I completely agree with that. Like never send, I think like the biggest no-no is if you've sent a reviewer hunting, then really good to avoid that. Just exactly what Christy said earlier about, this isn't I give this like analogy or this, I try to paint this picture often when I'm giving advice. Like this is probably because these reviewers have a lot of other important responsibilities, including reviewing your manuscripts, but balancing it with lots of others. So this is probably one of the very last things that they're doing. Like imagine it being 11 p.m. Maybe they've just put their kids to bed or something, and they're sitting down. So maybe not 11 p.m.
We've gotten 3 reminder emails from the editor, you know.
Right, yeah, 3 reminder emails like, I'm so sorry, I promise I will really do it by today. So it's late and you're exhausted, and just making it as easy as possible. And then the last thing I wanted to make sure to say in terms of like major no-nos is that, and I'm sure that this was like very well intentioned on the author's part, where I reviewed another manuscript and it wasn't as easy for me as the reviewer to see how they addressed my comments. And they said things like, we addressed it in the discussion. And then I was just kind of like, well, how? I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. So I would say, just as an example, just to be as specific as possible and to use direct quotes whenever possible. It really helps the reviewer to understand your process as the author.
I just wanted to bring up one point. I'm not reviewing manuscripts, but I know one thing that we've discussed in groups when we're doing a revision is when addressing the reviewer's comments in the actual revision letter about whether or not it's beneficial to use direct quotes from the actual, like their review comment, because of the question of interpretation. So I've taken an approach, and I've done both. So where like if the author is or the reviewer one is asking me to do something in the introduction, and so when I go to address that comment, I kind of give my interpretation of what they asked me to do, so that way the author or the reviewer knows how I understood what I think you asked me to do. So if I just copy and paste exactly what you said, my interpretation and yours could still be different. And so there's been some benefit to being like reviewer one asks for us to, be more clear and whatever. And then we did so by, and then like addressing it and being really specific in that. So that's just something I kind of wondered if I like that approach, because hopefully it's being clear where we're coming from. And so if there's some discrepancy where you're like, that's not what I was asking them to do, I don't know how much of a benefit it is to at least see, oh, this is how the authors must have interpreted my critique.
Depends on I think if there's something that's hard to interpret, absolutely. If it's just like you didn't dot an I across a T, then I wouldn't do it for things like that. I would do it for things that are murky, that are open to interpretation, different interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big deal when you get into that. I did not want to do this part because here's what I think you're asking me, and here's why you're wrong. Kind of thing.
That makes sense.
Thank you all for your different answers and overlapping answers as well. It seems like communicating clearly is also important in this part of the revise and resubmit. For our next question, what do you think maximizes likelihood that an R&R will get accepted? And I think we've probably talked a lot about that, making it easy for the reviewer. But if there's anything else that you all would like to add, please feel free to.
I would just say really quickly, so I said something that might seem contradictory a little bit earlier. I said that it really is in all of the co-authors' best interests to get it back under review as quickly as possible, but while you're doing so in a very thoughtful and thorough way. So I would say that another thing that increases the likelihood that an R&R will get accepted, or it will get another kind of revision, hopefully more minor the next time around, is to really spend time, to not rush it. I think is so important. And we might get to this a little bit later, but I think that as Christy alluded to earlier, it is absolutely okay, especially if it's done in the right way. Perhaps with the exception of special issues, it is absolutely okay to ask for an extension if you need more time. So to not rush it, I think really maximizes the likelihood as well that it's going to be good news following that revision submission.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, and this doesn't always work, but if the reviewer's comments are contradictory or they're confusing, sometimes you can ask for clarification. It'll go to the associate editor. But sometimes you can say, like, I don't really know how to deal with this, or do you have any advice? And it's going to depend on whether they have time or whether they really think it's a big deal if they're going to respond to you. But it's not necessarily always just this, like, you have to do this list of things without any sort of like context, because sometimes, the reviewers are typing fast, something doesn't make sense. Sometimes people really are in conflict, and the editor might have some insight, since they know who the reviewers are, about why this sort of came out. Like I said, that's not always going to work, but you don't have to treat it as like, okay, this is the 10 commandments written in stone that I have to respond to.
And just one quick thing to add on to that. So I already wrote in the chat that I completely agree. And also I find that when you're kind of interacting with the editor in that way, quite often you get a little bit of insight, not definitive insight, but insight about what might be a deal breaker for the editor. So how important the editor believes it is to address a certain comment versus another comment, or to incorporate that suggestion, I should say. So I think that's another reason why it can be really helpful to ask, well thought out questions, to not waste the editor's time. But if there's really a reason to seek clarification there, to not hesitate to do that.
Always working on my wait time. So, but if anyone else has anything to add, I think we did get into this question kind of throughout the other questions. And Dr. Byrd, I really appreciate your point about if there's contradictory feedback given to, and that you can reach out and ask. So I really appreciate that. And now I think this is the question that we've hinted at quite a bit throughout. But how do you approach reviewer feedback that you don't necessarily agree with?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it quickly. But I think that for me, it starts with like a really good and robust conversation amongst the team, of okay, how is everyone interpreting this? Where are we seeing where it could be helpful? And then kind of where do we land on why we will or will not kind of go for that? And do we have a very thoughtful, intentional, and evidence-based way to kind of talk about why we're not making that decision? Can we back up why we decided to not go with that suggestion? And so I know that conversation ends up being like a really helpful way to be able to decide kind of how to talk about a revision, a request that we don't agree with. And I think that we try to start from like, give it a good faith effort of like, okay, if they're trying to make the paper better, what would be the benefit to doing this? And then what are kind of the cons of that? So yeah, I guess my only thing was we just have really good discussions amongst our collaborators in deciding about it.
Yeah, I think conversation is really good. From my perspective, I've gotten a lot of R&Rs when I've been on my own. And so that's harder because you can talk to people, but they don't really have, if they haven't read their paper and the reviewer comments, it's hard for them to kind of give you that perspective. Over time, I've really come to the idea of you just have to choose what hill you're going to die on, right? Because when you don't do something the reviewer asks, you're basically just like making them more annoyed with you, and you have to justify. So they're going to get a kind of a negative tilt toward your article, even if you address everything else. And so my approach now is basically like, I'll do it unless it's something that like deeply conflicts with my values or with the approach that I'm taking. Because look, in the end, does it really matter if I have to report like the entropy and the AIC and the BIC? It's like I don't think it's useful. I don't care, but the reviewer cared, so I'll just go ahead and do it. And because I found that it makes the reviewers much more open to the rest of your review when you do respond to them. But at the same time, they do respond if there's something that's very serious. Like I studied school climate. I studied school racial climate. And I've had reviews come back where it's like, this is not school climate. And that's where it's like, look, no, it really is. And here's all my citations, why. And, I went through like basically 2 sets of revisions with this one reviewer who throughout the end was like, this isn't school climate. And by that time, the other reviewers were like, oh yeah, this is fine, this is fine. And that one person was still like, no. And I'm like, well, the paper's published. So that was like, those like that's just how I had to come to terms with it, because like the goal is to get the paper published, right? If you have to do this little annoying thing to make a reviewer happy, just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I feel like it's the editor's job to step in and help in some situations like that. And it is perfectly fine for you as the author to say, like, for example, if you have 2 completely conflicting review, comments, one person wants you to do A and one wants you to do B, and they're complete opposites. I mean, what I've learned is, like, when I see that, I usually will put in my letter. I mean, like, I'll give you an example without giving identities. I had in the motivation world, a lot of people know there's a lot of very strong opinions and camps and theories. And there was a paper where the recommendations couldn't have been more diametrically opposed. And I knew that when the author got it, they would like say, what am I supposed to do? So I just took it upon myself to say, I think you should pay attention to concerns in particular of reviewer C. And that's code for, I know you can't do both of these. And then they'll often reach out to me and say, I can't do both. And I'd say, I'll kind of tell them. And then, if there's one reviewer, who's just adamant and everyone else is convinced, it's the editor's prerogative to not send it back to that reviewer, or to just not pay attention to that. So if there's really, really conflicting things, ask the editor. That's what the editor's job is. Say, I really don't know what to do here. I can't please both people. The other thing I'd say is that's just really important is if you have feedback that you disagree with, you don't want to give the impression that you don't want to do something they're asking you to do because you're lazy. And I'm saying that not in a pejorative way. I'm just saying that because sometimes that is the impression that reviewers and editors get, is like, they could have done that. And so sometimes I'll see something like, somebody will say, like, it really makes sense that you maybe should have tested mediators. And they collected all the data on the mediators and they could easily do it. And they might, and sometimes they'll come back and say, yes, but mediation was not our original research question. And so because of that, we'll address that in another manuscript. Like, that's no good. I mean, if you haven't collected the data on the mediators, then, you say that's a great suggestion, you put it as a limitation, but you don't want to, even as polite as you are, you don't want to disagree with something because it just, so the reviewer will look at it and say, they just didn't want to be bothered.
100% agree with that. And on the flip side, it really sits well with me as a reviewer when I because for example, the things that come to mind, I review a lot of meta-analyses, and I'll say things like, it's exactly what Eric described. The tests that you use for publication bias are great, but I don't actually say they're great. The tests that you use for publication bias, I understand that, this is often convention, but what recent research has shown is that these tests for publication bias are much more trustworthy. I recommend that you consider doing that test. And when people get a comment like that, it is a bit of a drag because it requires rerunning analyses and your results, your conclusions might change. But when authors do it because they agree or they realize that it is the more kind of like methodologically sound approach, it goes a long way. And I take their quote rebuttals of why they didn't do other things sort of much more, much more seriously. I don't know. I'm not quite communicating in the right words what I mean. But
I mean, I think it's, Alison, what you're saying is that you as a reviewer want to trust that the author believes you are trying to improve the paper, right? That you're not just making a suggestion because you want to make more work for them. You really think that it's going to help them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other thing as well. As a reviewer, exactly that Christy said, what Christy said, I'm not interested in creating unnecessary work for people. I don't think that makes any sense. So I was going to say something else. It's lost my, I'll say it later, maybe in the chat if it comes back. Oh, yeah, it came back to me. Affirming goes a long way. It might sound silly, but especially so when you agree, affirm. And when you disagree, affirm. I think that it goes a long way to acknowledge your understanding of why the reviewer, but don't affirm if you really disagree and you think that what they're saying is offensive, then of course don't affirm in that case. But let's say somebody, like I say, I recommend that you try this publication bias test, and the author doesn't agree with it for a very understandable reason. If I were that author, I might say, thank you for pointing this out. I agree that in certain cases, this is the most rigorous test. In our specific meta-analysis, it is not, and here's why. So I think that just that kind of affirmation or that acknowledgement of understanding why a reviewer is making a suggestion and then explaining, even in light of that, why you're not going to incorporate the suggestion in the way that they made it can go a long way. So that was the only other thing I was going to add.
I also address Andrew's question that, so once it goes back to the editor, they have the choice to accept it just based on your reviews, which happens, sometimes, but not that often, or they'll send it back to the reviewers. And sometimes they won't be able to get the exact same reviewer, so they'll send it out to a new set. So a lot of that's kind of about the availability and what time frame they want to get the paper published and how well they think you respond to the reviews. If they're like, hey, you checked all the boxes, I think the reviewers would agree with me, I'm not going to send it out again.
Kind of along the same lines as what we've been discussing, and I think we've started to kind of touch on it. But if an editor decides to reject your work, is it ever appropriate to push back and ask that they reconsider?
Pick your battles. I mean, it's okay to do it, but don't do that often. Do that. I would definitely, if you're a grad student, I would check with your advisor before you do it. It's okay if there's really, really a good reason, but like, I really mean that sincerely. Pick your battles. Like, if an editor rejects it, they have their reason. You may not know the reason. Sometimes there could be all kinds of reasons why. And again, editors sort of have the final word on things. You can appeal an editor's decision, like if it's an APA journal, there's a process, and you definitely can do that. But it's pretty unusual for it to happen. So yes, you can do it. And I'm not trying to sound like, like that you should, lay down your honor, and if the editor's wrong, that you shouldn't fight for what you think is right. But you have to pick your battles, because you can develop a reputation. This is a small world, so do it when it's appropriate. I've had people come back to me and challenge me, and there have been one or two times, and I've said, you know what, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. That makes sense. I didn't think of that. And there have been a couple other times when I've said, no, I'm sorry, but the 3 reviewers and I all felt the same way, and I wish you the best of luck. Try another journal.
Yeah, I'll preface my response by saying that anytime I've ever gotten a rejection, I'm just like, oh, okay, thank you, and then move on. Like I've never kind of pushed back, but I totally agree with Eric that thoughtfully doing so, I think that there's a distinction where for whatever reason is, and as Eric said, editors have their reasons, and they're usually really well thought out. For whatever reason, they've decided that your work is not a great fit for the journal. There's that, but then there's also, I think, perhaps especially with equity focused work, where a reviewer may not have the understanding that is necessary to really kind of see the value in really incredible work that is well suited for a journal. That's an example of where I think if there's a fundamental misunderstanding and the editor may not have caught it, I think that's a good example of when it would be appropriate to ask the editor to reconsider, again, with a very sort of well thought out rationale for why. So anyway, I'll pause there to see what other people think. But yeah, I think it's a fine line.
Yeah, I think it's a very fine line. And sometimes it's a systematic issue. Like there are journals in our field that I was rejected from because, oh, this doesn't fit with Ed Psych, right? And now I'm a reviewer for those journals. Now my work is cited in those journals. So sometimes the best revenge is just going on and being amazing. It's not always worth the effort to try and make the case to people who don't get it yet. There's going to be another journal out there. One paper is not going to define your career. So maybe it's best to just turn to the next stage. I mean, when I submit papers, I make a list of journals that I'm going to submit it to, right? I have 3 or 4 journals and say, okay, if it doesn't get through here, here's the next one I'm going to. And I have that ready to go.
But I think that's a really good point about fit, but you can avoid that to some extent by, once you pick the journal you're going to submit to, by being very strategic and making it fit. And what I mean by making it fit is go through the last couple of years of that journal and look at what they've published. And I don't mean that you should change your work at all, but you should look at the kinds of things they published. And if you see things there'll be things that will give you a clue as to how to make it fit. And you might want to cite some other things that they've had in there that are relevant so that you can tip the scales, because that's always just an opinion. That always happens with, I do a lot of longitudinal stuff and I've submitted to developmental journals, and I can't tell you how many times they've said, this isn't developmental, this is Ed Psych. And, and I've learned that, well, that's just an opinion. It is developmental, but if I had taken the time to really look at some of the developmental papers that were published in my area, I probably could have made a more convincing case for why. So I do think you can be strategic in that sense. There are some cases where it simply doesn't fit. And another example, sometimes there's too many of something on a same topic. I had a situation with Theory into Practice. We do pretty much all special issues where I just kept getting proposals for special issues on bullying. And bullying is really important, but I said, we're going to become the journal of bullying. We can't keep, we've got to, there's part of it is just to ensure that there is breadth in what's there. And that's a hard message. Someone may have a really good proposal, but sometimes it's just for, particularly in non-empirical journals, when it's review articles and things like that, sometimes it's a matter of making sure there's enough breadth in there to be appealing to the readership. And so you can't have everything too much on any one topic. And sometimes it's just a matter of bad timing on your part as an author.
Well, thank you all for your thoughts and advice on doing that. Definitely is very tricky. And thank you, Dr. Byrd, too, for raising like the systematic issues and what's being published in Ed Psych, and like really saying thank you, because I feel like our field is making progress. And I think it's because people like you are getting on editorial boards, and we can see the work that like Dr. Graham and Dr. Gumby have been like working for to make our field a little bit better. And so just really like thank you in acknowledging that. But thank you all for that advice. I think that was something we all were kind of interested in, like how do you push back? And so for our last question, before we'll go to the live Q&A, and I think you all have been answering a lot of the live Q&A throughout this process, but what do you all wish you knew before you completed your first R&R?
I would say for me, just I maybe wish I would have known how much work it was. I guess you really can't know until you really get into it, because you're just so excited you finally got an R&R, and it's just a lot of work and a lot of thinking that has to go into it. So I think that was a big thing. And then, yeah, my first revise and resubmit, I didn't know about the revision letter. So people getting that information out there that you'll have to, and it makes total sense, but I just didn't know. So when we started pulling that up, I was like, oh, a whole nother part, great. So those things were definitely two that I wish I had known ahead of time, but sometimes you just have to experience it.
Yeah, I'll add, I think that's great advice. And I will add that, first of all, with the revision letter, I'm so glad that, you know, the organizers of this have put together a panel like this, because so many people, including, I don't even know how I learned about the revision letter. It was probably the first time that I did an R&R too. But I think that until you're on the reviewer side, you don't know just how important that response to reviewer's document is. It's just as important, I would argue, as the manuscript. So it's one thing. So I think that there are kind of two parts to an R&R. One is addressing the reviewer's comments and you know, improving the manuscript. But then the other, which is very important, is explaining how you did that. It's not enough to just address. It's to explain how you addressed. And then another thing that I want to make sure to say is, you know, obviously I study feedback, and essentially this is a feedback experience. You're getting so much feedback, and a lot of it, I think sometimes, you know, reviewers are in a rush and they forget to point out all the things that they really valued about a manuscript. And so I just want to kind of normalize, like, when you get a million comments back in an R&R, it can feel, as Brooke was saying, it is so much work and it can feel incredibly overwhelming. But it really is good news. And it's hard to make that attribution. I think it goes back to Brooke's initial point about like the balancing of emotions, but it really means that people in a very challenging peer review process saw a lot of promise in your work and they're excited to learn more about it. So that's something I guess I wish I knew, just that all of those comments mean that the reviewers think it's worth writing all of those comments and making all of those suggestions, and same with the editor.
Yeah, I mean, that was what I was going to say. Like, an R&R is a good thing. It's a really good thing. Like, some of these journals have like a 10% acceptance rate. So the fact that you even got a request for revisions is a good thing. And it also, all those comments means that someone was engaged. They were interested in what you were doing. And so that's amazing. I think that, you know, it's hard to take the feedback sometimes, but it really does mean that your work is going to be better and it's going to be out there in the world. So take it as a good thing. I wish I had appreciated that more when I first started out. And then I see the question about submitting as a grad student on your own. Absolutely submit, but, you know, get feedback from people. Make sure your advisor knows what you're doing. But yeah, definitely, you don't have to submit with other people. You don't have to, you know, have a perfect 100% draft that's read by 50 people in order to submit. You know, my first paper that I got no request for revisions or like minor revisions was by myself. You know, and that's never happened again. Like, minor revisions requested, but that was by myself, so it works.
All right. Well, thank you all for your answers. And if anyone has questions that they dropped in the chat that they want to elaborate on, please feel free to do so. I think most of the questions have been answered in kind of real time, but I know there's one more that was in the chat, and it's for a systematic literature review paper. Do you have any suggestions for the number of papers or articles that we review?
That's a really good question. Just to clarify, and please let me know if I'm misunderstanding, because it's funny with the term review, that could be interpreted in this context in two different ways. So in terms of the number of papers that are included in the systematic review, so I actually have a lot of strong thoughts on this, where 2 papers is in theory enough for a systematic review. I wouldn't necessarily like recommend that, but what I'm trying to communicate is that a really strong systematic review can have actually very few papers. And I think that a really unique contribution in and of itself is highlighting the major gaps within that literature. And a systematic review can also have a ton of articles included within that. And then also another way that that can be interpreted is like the number that you review, like as a reviewer. I don't think that's what the person meant who raised the question, but I just in case that's how it was meant, I do have the pleasure of reviewing a lot of systematic reviews. And I will say that it takes me longer than a primary study most of the time. And probably those of you, I know that at least several of you have also had that experience, just because there's a lot to go through. There's often a lot of tables and all that. So I would say don't take on too many at once, especially if you're just starting out.
For the systematic review, in terms of how many like papers you should cite within the review, you know, it so varies. It depends on what you're writing about. I'd say the one thing to avoid at all costs is making it sound like a shopping list. Just saying this paper said this and this paper said this, and that's gonna get you, that's not gonna get you a revise and resubmit.
And does anyone have any other questions from the audience that you all want to? And I appreciate the question about the systematic literature review, because I think that can be interesting for when you submit and get feedback as well.
I have a question, I guess more about like the behind the scenes of like what a reviewer sees. And maybe this is like for our next Motivation Monday panel as well, but I'm wondering about from your perspective as a reviewer, like, is it typical that you get the same reviewers and then like once you've reviewed a paper and then you get the feedback or they address your revisions, like, do you specifically go like line by line, did they address this, or do you read the whole manuscript? I guess I'm just like wondering about that process, trying to get perspective of like how I would, you know, address those revisions. Does that make sense?
I think it's a really good question, but Eric, I saw you unmuted, so.
Well, I was gonna say it honestly depends on the paper. If my review, if I only had very specific things, I often am commenting on the method, you know, that's often what I hone in on. And if I didn't really have any big problems with the lit review or other stuff, then, you know, to be honest, I'll go and just look at my points and see, did they address those? But I'll look for every single point that I have. Depends. Sometimes if there was a lot and if the paper was substantially rewritten, then I'll reread the whole thing. But if it's just very specific things, then I'll just go to those, because that I go back to, that's the editor's responsibility to go back and say, you know, each reviewer is looking, did they respond to my concerns and did they raise any new issues? Which happens sometimes, but then the editor is the one who has to sort of read the whole thing and say, does it still make sense, or is it, you know, gobbledygook?
I'm the same as Eric on that I, you know, the first time I review a paper, I read everything, because I feel like as a reviewer, it's my responsibility to do that. I thoroughly read the entire thing. And then I agree with Eric that it really depends on the manuscript. If I'm reading a revised version of that manuscript, whether I stick to kind of seeing how and in what way they addressed my comments, or if I believe that as the reviewer, like it requires for me to give a thoughtful review, a more holistic like read through of it.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, unless I'm really like interested in the topic, then I will read a bunch of the other reviews and like just get really into the weeds. The only exception is if I am reading a revision that I was not one of the original reviewers on, which sometimes happens. So if I get, you know, I'm a new reviewer, then I will go back, read what were the comments, what's the manuscript. And sometimes I have to go back to the original manuscript to understand, like, wait, what was the changes here? But usually I'm focused on kind of what was I really interested in? What did I think the major issues were? And did they address those things? Yeah, ask your advisor to review a paper with them the next time they get one, because we get them all of the time. So yes, I'm sure they'd be happy to share the list.
Yeah, I recently got a revise and resubmit that had a student comment, grad student perspective review in there. And I thought that was interesting. And they brought up some really great points.
And I'm gonna link, and if it loads in time, and then if not, I'll put it in the chat in a second. Yes, okay. In a second, I'm gonna put an article written by Kate Snyder. It's published in Gifted Child Quarterly, but I think it's very kind of relevant or applicable for our entire field and beyond as well. It's basically just a how-to review guide, and I just like it's so helpful. So completely agree with Christy that I already put this in the chat, but definitely try to be a co-reviewer first. Brooke, I also think it's so cool. I've had that a couple times before, like the main reviewers' comments, and then separately the student co-reviewer. I think that and I really appreciated their insight in that process. So that was really helpful. But yeah, I think that as well, when you're starting to review, reading an article and ideally discussing it with your advisor, how to arrive at a certain recommendation, I think is a big thing that's not actually that intuitive. Like if something's a reject, why are you suggesting a rejection? Things like that. So I know everyone's probably like, where's this article? I'll put it in the chat.
Well, thank you all for your answers, and I'll add in a little bit too, just to have some thoughts. I think it's super helpful as a grad student to help co-review manuscripts. One, I feel like a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, you get to see it on the other side, which is really helpful. And I think that's what people have mentioned as well. Two, something that's really nice. It's like, I know social comparisons are not very good most of the time, but it's nice to see articles before they've gone through the entire review process and are now this like very pretty published paper. Because like reviewers give great feedback and people like change their papers. So when I got to co-review, I was like, oh, this is nice, because it's like you see the perfect like published paper, but it's a lot different at the beginning of that submission process. But for our last question of the day,
there's a couple more questions in the
Oh, is there?
chat. Corey, I was also going to say that, since most papers don't get published, you see a lot of the bad papers when you when you review, right?
I didn't think about that too.
That actually goes to, I think, Arun's point is that, will you start writing better? I think for me, it has definitely made me realize things that are annoying to read and that I want to try to avoid as a writer. But I think writing is also a very individualized kind of thing. So, some things you can steal, other things like, I just won't do that in the future. Oh, and then there's I was going to address the other question about imposter syndrome. I think that reading other people's reviews has helped me to understand, oh, I have a perspective on this paper, and sometimes the other reviewers agree with me. There's a couple times where it's like, I'm the only one who thinks this. But then other times, it's really, I love it, that feeling when the editor is like, and yeah, you should really pay attention to what reviewer 3 said when I'm reviewer 3, because then that sort of gives you that validity. But you are in this field, right? You are learning to do research. You have done research. So your perspective is valid. As long as you're not like being rude about it, there's something in what you're seeing. And you may need some help in sort of articulating it, but your perspective is important. And that's why you're asked to be a reviewer.
And I would add, and this is something, when I was new at this and like right out of grad school, I definitely can relate to, feeling that imposter syndrome and reviewing things and thinking, I don't really know what to say about this, but I should know or I'll look dumb. And with age comes wisdom, I guess. And, even like now, if there are parts of a manuscript that I can't comment on, I'll just write in the review and say, this part is really not my area of expertise, so I'm going to leave that to other reviewers. And that's that's okay. I'd rather, be honest about that, because we're not all experts on everything. So you don't need to comment on something that you don't have expertise about. Comment on the parts that you do. One of the other things I'll also say, it wasn't mentioned, but as a reviewer, is no matter what, when I'm reviewing something, I'm not talking about as an editor, as a reviewer, I will always take the time to say some positive things, no matter what, even if I think it's the worst thing I ever read. I will find some redeeming qualities and really try to put a positive spin on it in some way. I think that's really important, because mostly this is just a list of how terrible, you get this thing, 5 pages of how your work stinks. All these people telling all these bad things. And so, I think in reviews, it's just really good for us to, as the reviewer, and certainly as the editor, but as the reviewers, to point out some positives about it, because that isn't done all the time.
100% agree. And I think it's so easy. I know now we're kind of getting to the reviewer side, but it's so easy as a reviewer to forget how much time and effort and thought has been devoted to this paper. And also, I think, Andrew, the question you raised is such a good one. And I agree. I do the same thing as Eric. When I don't have the expertise to comment on a specific aspect of the paper, I will say that to the editor. So that's what a really good example of something to put in the confidential comments for editor, or I might even sometimes say it in my responses to the authors. But I don't have, for example, I do not have expertise in qualitative research. So I'm not going to comment on that kind of on the methodological approach to this paper. I decided to really focus my comments on the introduction and the discussion of the interpretation of motivation theory, whatever it might be. But I think I completely agree with Christy that it can be really, so another benefit, so we kind of implied this, but we haven't explicitly stated it. When you review or when you co-review, quite often you get the decision letter, and then you also get to see what the other reviewers' comments are. And I think that can be a really helpful learning experience. And it can also be really affirming in 2 ways. One is if your comments align with the reviewers, that can be affirming. But then also if your comments complement or contribute something unique, I think that can also kind of help overcome I made this point and I think it's a really good point and no other reviewers caught it. So I'm glad that the authors have this suggestion from me. So I totally get it. I felt the exact same way. And I think that co-reviewing and getting feedback from your advisor and kind of practicing can also be really helpful. And then the last thing I'll say is if you happen to, I don't know, this is a little bit more tentative, and I invite the other panelists to disagree with me, but if you happen to know the action editor, I think that in some cases, you don't want to waste their time, but in some cases you might reach out and say, I'm pretty new to reviewing. Was that, was my review okay? What might you suggest? But again, wanting to be mindful of the action editor's time. I don't know how they do it, honestly. But I think that could be appropriate in certain situations as well.
Yeah, I found that certain journals or certain editors just have a very mentoring focus. So, there's one of the editors of the journal that I reviewed for, it was really nice at a conference to just kind of talk to him, and that, that came up and oh yeah, you're doing a good job at reviewing. That felt really nice. Yeah. There's another question about looking at a particular theory, and this one's tricky. And I have a lot of feelings about it because sometimes it is that sort of fit of this is important to me, this is the perspective I'm coming with, and this journal just maybe is not the right journal for it. And other times it really hits at something important. So a paper I just reviewed, we were basically it was multiple of the reviewers to say you need a theoretical framework. What's the theoretical framework here? And then they added in a little line about I don't remember what motivation theory it was, but they just added 2 sentences. And I was this isn't it. No, that's not what we meant. First off, you're studying these Black kids, and we were trying to kind of make this argument. We were trying to tell them you need to make this more culturally focused. There's something important about the this being a Black sample here. And their response was just to take all of the culture out and then just add this one little 2-sentence thing about this theory that was, just sort of very general. And part of that, I think, was that like that non-responsiveness is like, oh, I think this is fine. But we were really getting at something really essential about their paper. And again, we wanted it to be the best it could be, but the way they responded to it was just like, oh, well, I'm just going to kind of do the minimum here. And that did not go. That paper was rejected after that round.
Sometimes reviewers will suggest another theory because sometimes we get so enmeshed in our favorite theory du jour that sometimes the reviewer will look at it and just say, that theory doesn't make sense for your research question. So sometimes they're trying in a gentle way to nudge you and say, this is not a goal theory question. This is an attribution theory question. That is what you are asking. So you might want to consider reframing it. And you're not changing, the people sometimes think that's sacrilegious, and it's not. You're not reframing. If you're changing your research question or you're changing your data, that's unethical. Changing your theoretical framework to explain it sometimes, that's sometimes very, very necessary, because you say, oh, the whole thing falls into place and makes sense if I explain it. Or you could explain things with two theories. You don't have to have one theory. Some of the strongest studies out there are written with multiple theories. And I think most people today who get grants funded use multiple theoretical frameworks.
And that's where your advisor can be really helpful, right? To help to say, like, why did they suggest that? Do you really think that's worthwhile? And then they might be like, yeah, or like, no, they just didn't get it. That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, I do hope, at least, I know that when I'm reviewing, I'm trying to help. I never want to just sort of make a suggestion for the sake of making a suggestion. So sometimes I'll suggest, citing other work or something like that, citing another theoretical perspective. And it's always because I think that it will enrich the paper. And honestly, if I think that something that I've done or I've published is a really good fit, I'm actually the least likely to ever suggest that. Like when I'm the reviewer, like I'm always sort of, so anyway, all of that is to say that I think that unless a reviewer is being really rude or disrespectful, which sadly sometimes happens, and I think as Eric was, I think he mentioned in a comment earlier, I really hope the editor catches that so it never gets back to the authors. But if assuming you're not experiencing a reviewer who's being really rude or disrespectful, I think it's just good to keep in mind, just like it's important for reviewers to keep in mind that so much time and thought has gone into the manuscript that they're reviewing. And then on the flip side, it's good, even though after your pity party, after your anger party, good to remind yourself that 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, maybe 7.5, the reviewer is really trying to help. And so I'll stop there, but.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists and all of the audience members for your engagement here today. I think we've learned so much from the panelists, and I'm really appreciative to everyone who's asked questions. It's really helpful to get other people's perspectives. Maybe like I was wondering that too, or like, oh, I didn't even think of that. And I'm really glad that I can think of that. So for our final activity that we'll do, we've started, and this is all pretty, I believe, using Jamboards to kind of make collective notes for all of us that we can share. So here is the link to the Jamboard. So if anyone wants to write any reflections on the Jamboard, there's instructions on how to do that. I think Preeti put that together as well. So big thank you. And this is just a way for all of us to be able to come back and look at what we've all learned today together. But thank you all for your time here today. Thank you to the Graduate Student Committee for putting on these Motivation Mondays and all of our other events. We do have, scroll down. We have our affinity group discussion on February 28th at 7 p.m. And so don't forget to join us too for our next Motivation Monday on March 4th. And it's kind of the complement to this discussion, and it's on peer reviewing research. So this can be really helpful for all of us grad students that want to start peer reviewing research and kind of get some experience with that. And so as we close, I want to thank our panelists for their insight and enriching conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And we hope to see you soon. So thank you all and have a great rest of your Valentine's Day or Monday night.